one of the points which I think we are mentioning perhaps for the first time, and that is the descent of the doctrine of rebirth in Europe from the fall of the Greek schools to the rise of modern knowledge. This doctrine was perpetuated in Europe. It was perpetuated not only by Jewish Kabbalists, but by Christian Kabbalists. And there was a thin thread of this belief, even in the Dark Ages, and in the period of the Renaissance, and down through the dawn of the modern way of thinking, with its indebtedness to Galileo, Harvey, Descartes, and other dawn thinkers of our modern generation. So this teaching suddenly flares up among the Jewish mystics. Why? How is it that a doctrine which had so little sympathy from their Christian neighbors and so little support from the Torah should have been developed in such exquisite detail in the Sefer HaZohar? This book was widely read and was widely influential among the literary-minded Jewish people. It attacked many principles of Orthodox Jewry. It did not permit much of the psychological pattern that has always dominated Jewish personal and family life. It violated, in many respects, at least the prevalent interpretations of the Torah and the Mosaic Code. Yet it flourished in Spain, in Italy, in France, and was held by a large number of scholarly believers all the way down through the reigns of the Medicis and the Borgias. It's almost incredible to assume that a whole series of these doctrines moving westward, doctrines which were essentially so close to the Asiatic pattern of life, could simply have come from nowhere or merely represented the speculations of single persons. Here we have another example of the development of traditions. These traditions bore very heavily upon the nature of the divine being at the root of life. And in the rise of the Zohar, we see the Jewish concept of deity undergoing marked changes. Changes which were later to profoundly influence the Christian faith. How did these changes arise and where did they come from? Were they indigenous to Europe or the Near East, or did they come from far Asia? As time goes on, I believe the general tendency will be to suspect far Asia. I think we will gradually be forced by the development of more adequate records to recognize that religion is a common motion, and that it is like a river that may flow through one country but have its headwaters in another. And this diffusion of ideas was possible at the time with which we are most concerned. And it is very possible that the reason for this sudden outburst of similar doctrines in assorted regions came as the result of the maturing or developing of more adequate travel facilities, particularly the increase of caravan trade. The trade was to provide luxuries for the Romans and the Latins, but the byproduct was the communication of ideas. For these traders brought with them their beliefs and their doctrines. We know that this trading process, a few centuries later, was to be the principal foundation for the rise of Islam. But for our present concern, I think the transformation of the nature of deity is the first matter to be considered. Our primitive ancestors gradually passed from the worship of nature to the worship of spirits, from the recognition of visible forces to the acceptance of invisible causes beyond these forces. These causes themselves passed through innumerable reformations on the part of man. As his experience increased, it became essential to revise his theology, to keep his theology abreast of his intellectual achievements and his physical experiences. Gradually, the concept of deity as represented in the Mosaic Code took form, not in one area, but in many areas. And deity emerged as a being, a transcendent person. As the system was patriarchal, the deity assumed the aspect of the great father power. It was usually personified or impersonated as a most venerable person, a great superhuman being. A being, however, fashioned in the likeness of a man. A being like the mysterious and noble figure casting from his hands the sun and moon, as represented on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. This being was the great patriarch and was compounded out of the elders, the heroes of long ago, the fathers of tribes, the venerated sages and scholars, the great priests and saints of long ago. All of these contributed their parts to the creation of the God image. And this God image was great of power, universal of authority, but subject, like the creatures that fashioned it, to the whimsies of disposition and temperament, subject naturally to favoritism in bringing particular advantage and security to its chosen people. This God image was remote, like perhaps the great golden figure of Zeus at Olympus. It was power, but it was a power inscrutable, a power with which man could have very little intimate understanding association. It was a power that ran all things according to its own will. And in this power, men were but pawns in a great game. The gods could sweep away men merely by the will to do so. And these gods lived in a heaven world or region far from the abode of men, even though, like ancient Odin, they occasionally seated themselves upon the throne of all-seeing and looked out upon the world to see that it was still in order. We find this kind of deity not only arising in the Near East, but having already arisen in other ancient regions as Egypt, India, and China. We find roots of it in the nature worship of Japan, Shinto. We see, therefore, God as the ancestor. We see God as the ancient one. And we also lived in a world ruled by certain inscrutable laws and processes, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This God was a God of justice and of vengeance. This was the deity whom men did not dare to offend. They could respect, they could fall in awe before the thought or image of this God, but they could not meet it with personal affection. It was too distant and too far.